The golden age of YouTube is over. I'm about to go out for a walk. Maybe you'd like to join me, and we can talk about what you may have heard other kind of left adjacent YouTubers talking about, and that I mentioned in my video on AI slop, that it's getting more and more difficult to make content, to be seen, to be paid for those views in a way that's sustainable. There are, of course, lots of different takes on this, but YouTubers have been pointing to their Patreons or taking a hiatus or talking about issues with making maybe more educational content on a platform designed for entertainment and clicks and attention. But let's talk about this. Is it true? What's going on?
Seems like the common kind of feeling at the moment is that social media platforms and YouTube are recommending dross over quality content. But again, is this true? So to set the scene a bit, the analogy I like to point to, which I know the most about, I've been reading about for a long time, is the analogy of the press and the history of the media, which I've made a video on, but I'd like to discuss a little bit more. The obvious historical trend, is the commercialisation and consolidation of the press, particularly newspapers across the 19th century. And what you had in the 19th century could be seen as similar to what we've had on YouTube and the internet. This plurality of, in the printing press case, pamphlets, smaller publications, lots of different books, flourishing of ideas during the Enlightenment. And in the internet case, lots of little blogs and lots of little YouTube channels, all different sorts, moving slowly towards a kind of model of concentration where, your Daily Wires or your Joe Rogans or your big newspapers like the Daily Mail could outcompete, could out-resource, could get the advertising, could buy all the technology, the innovative, the advanced printing presses, steam presses, colour printing, photography, telegraph, reporters, so that you end up squeezing out the little guy. And what you have here aligns with what Marx and many other economists said in lots of different ways. It's that capitalism tends towards economies of scale where the smaller businesses get outcompeted and bought out, and economies of scale make things cheaper and it becomes much harder to compete, and so everything concentrates into what you had in Germany as the cartels, or you had in America as robber barons across time. And the same thing happens with media too. It's also a useful analogy because both technologies are quite cheap. The human copyist before the printing press would take up to a year to reproduce a book. So the cost of a book, very loosely, is the cost of your average, maybe slightly educated, well, I guess very educated if you could read and write, salary. So hugely expensive. Even the Gutenberg Bible cost a similar amount. At first, print runs were very, very small, 10 or 15, I believe. And technology gradually improved over the centuries and kept improving up to the 19th and 20th century. And of course, print technology continues to improve today. But one of the big leaps was the steam printing press, which could produce, I think, something like 4,000 impressions per day compared to 500 of the hand printing press. This is technology that gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And of course, today, if I wanted to print a book, I could go and do it very cheaply. Anyone could, pretty much. You can go and get, say, 10 copies of your book printed without a publisher, something like, £50, $70. So both technologies slowly become much, much more accessible. They're still expensive, of course, but they're much, much cheaper than, say, setting up a TV station or radio station. So, and they get cheaper over time. So there are two reasons that historical period or that historical technological trend is analogous to today. But there's also a kind of strange inversion going on here, because while the technologies are getting cheaper, the technologies or the subsidiary technologies around it are advancing too. So you need more and more technology to keep up. So again, with the printing press, you have reporters on photography and telegraphy, colour, speed, the mailing, to do a national newspaper, mailing all newspapers around the country and having paper boys, all this kind of thing. So it's very hard to keep up. And to give an example of this, even though the technology is getting cheaper over time, in 1918, when the Sunday Express launched in Britain, it cost £2 million capital investment. And I can't remember his name, but he didn't make his money back until he reached a circulation of 250,000 people, 250,000 newspapers, which I guess, one per family is more than 250,000 people. The point is, it cost £2.5 million to compete just to reach 250,000 people. I'm able to do this on YouTube much cheaper, and many people are. So the point is this: if the technology is getting cheaper, why can't anyone launch a newspaper? Of course anyone can. I remember when I was young, I thought about making a local newspaper. I mean, I'm talking 7, 8 years old. Of course anyone can. The problem is not the financial barrier to entry. The problem is getting people's attention. That the collective consciousness has a limited span. And as that collective consciousness gets filled, especially filled with people with better technology and skills, and the skills of psychological persuasion to enter into the attention economy and grab attention through sensationalist stories and headlines and all the rest of it, becomes harder and harder to compete. Add into this the logic of advertising funds to gravitate towards the middle. Advertising does not like a leftist or working class publication. And in fact, a lot of it doesn't like a very luxury, wealthy publication either. It gravitates to the place where the most people have got the most money on aggregate, which tends to be kind of bulky middle class, upper middle class maybe, middle earning. And so those publications get even more money, even better technology, even better reporters. Take one example of this. The Daily Herald was the largest working class newspaper in the middle of the 20th century in Britain. It had a quarter of all readership, yet despite this, it only had about 3.5% share of advertising funds. And eventually it got sold and turned into The Sun, which is a populist, middle-aiming newspaper. A quick break. This is Cheadale in Derbyshire, by the way. I'm just doing a loop round. It's raining a little bit, but if we swim round, see the river. I'm going to walk all the way along, down through the dale, back up the other side. We'll get to TV and radio, but I think of this as a kind of populist equation. You have those economies of scale, the concentration, the consolidation, the advertising money pointing towards the middle at the expense of the working class, newspapers in particular. You have the kind of sensationalism and the clickbait and the kind of topics that rile people up. And there are kind of economic and psychological incentives too, and you might be thinking that, okay, this kind of applies to the 19th century, but this doesn't apply to someone like Joe Rogan. You don't need huge economies of scale. All you need is two people talking in a room with a microphone, and people just happen to enjoy listening to him. And I think that's largely true, and I think there are a lot of differences that we'll get to, but I think, you don't have to. I talk of this in some way like it's purposeful, and I don't think it's purposeful. Marx talked about this as a system of inevitability that would ultimately lead to capitalism's collapse because of this, the nature of this race to the bottom and the competition between the consolidation and the monopolisation. But I think you can kind of be there culturally as well, like Joe Rogan is. You can kind of be in that middle ground and have people come to you and happen to take advantage of it because of who you are and the opinions you have, So, it's not purposeful, but I do think there's a logic to it. And I think it's really interesting to think about the similarities between kind of online AI culture today and those new printing techniques in the 19th century, the colour, the bold fonts, the sensationalism, the kind of yellow journalism of Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer, who engaged in this tit for tat. You have all these hoaxes published as if it was real. And imagine the similarities between someone looking at AI slop today and someone looking at these new colour tabloids with photographs and linographs and big fonts and strange articles for the first time. I think the effect psychologically would be somewhat similar. It's both kind of this grotesque, gauche, weird, strangely attractive but kind of nauseating thing with no purpose, designed to capture your attention.
So, will this continue happening on the internet? Well, even though it's unwise to generalise to this degree about history, I do think you can see these trends kind of happening very loosely over and over. To start with a very big, old, broad generalisation, you could argue that the kind of plurality of thought in ancient Greece, a very wide number of thinkers and the number of innovations through of ideas, but also through writing, was kind of flattened out and condensed and consolidated into the church, which lasted for a very long time. So, maybe you could have this first flourishing of writing as a technology, and the production of knowledge in scrolls and books, and then this was kind of homogenized into a more static structure and passed down through the church. You could also jump ahead and look at the printing press, the Reformation. You had this plurality that we've talked about, and that was then consolidated into the commercial presses, the big commercial presses. You could even go to, say, radio. If you look at the history of the BBC before TV, you look at radio. First, radio technology was driven by hobbyists, but because of the limitations of the bandwidth, you could only have a certain number of radio stations. In Britain, at least, you had a monopoly led by the BBC, but this was challenged by lots of pirate radio stations. So people were tuning out and listening to radio stations on ships or from the continent, and this kind of forced the BBC to having some popular music. But you can see the same dynamic between this kind of monolith in the middle and a plurality of different types of voices and music from the outside. You could look at television. At first there was this desire, if you look in America, to counter the limitation on bandwidth by forcing television stations to have some educational content, to not just have entertainment in the pursuit of views and advertising money. So you had to have some news, you had to have some kind of documentary, but this was always in tension with the goals and desires of executives at the big television networks. And you can see early innovations in things like documentary, like Ed Murrow's See It Now, which talked about McCarthyism and communism and very serious topics, were cancelled very quickly. They were too much of a headache for executives. They would much rather just focus on entertainment. One of my favourite kind of illustrations of this dynamic in early television were the quiz show scandals in America. In a way, these are about information. There's some education smuggled in through entertainment. But there was this big scandal across a number of different quiz shows in which it was found out that they were rigged to keep the popular contestants on by giving them the right answers, because the popular, more entertaining contestants in the quiz shows got the viewers. And of course, you can think of the caricature of the stuffy intellectual, the nerdy guy with glasses, that maybe people don't want to watch as much over the kind of stereotypical hot person, for example. So back to the internet. You're always going to have this big, bulky, populist middle that everything gravitates toward. Entertainment, like junk food, is always going to be attractive. The difference is with all these older mediums, the bandwidth was much narrower. So there was a limitation on what you could have on television and radio, and even the printing press to a degree. I'm an optimist, and the internet is still very, very cheap. The costs of producing are very low, and it's the first real many-to-many medium that could potentially, because you're not just driven by, you have to watch Mr. Beast because he's what's on at 8 p.m. Because of that choice, because of the algorithmic power of connecting a small group of esoteric individuals who are interested in one thing with another small group of esoteric producers who make content about that thing, that it could still be the first medium that escapes this populist logic of driving everything to the middle. Maybe the platforms we have at the moment won't be the ones to do that. Maybe they'll wither and die. Maybe they'll be forced to change. I think, as I said in the AI slop video, I think they've been forced to acknowledge somewhat that it's not in anyone's interest to just have platforms flooded with low quality, cheap slop. But I think, to return to the original question of whether the golden age is over, I think there's a fascinating inversion and paradox going on here, because everyone who's given the kind of impression that the golden age is over is someone that produces information. And I think if you are an early adopter of these technologies, like a lot of I'd call myself a second adopter. I've been doing this for 9-10 years, but I wasn't one of the very first movers. But the people right at the beginning, as with every other technology, have a massive, massive advantage. That's as good as it's ever going to be for those people. Just because more and more people are going to join the platforms, more and more people are going to be doing it. And that is going to be the continual beauty of the internet. So the golden age, in a sense, is over for us creators, because there's going to be less and less collective attention to go around. It's going to be spread much more thinly, and there's going to have to be, if you want to be doing it for a living consistently full time, which it is important that we have people that do that, because if you've got people that are just doing it part-time, it's very difficult to produce high-quality stuff. But it's going to be more difficult, more competitive. And I think creators are going to have to find new ways of sustaining it by maybe offering more on their Patreons, doing more stuff that's behind a little bit of a paywall. And it's really difficult, that, because you're competing with, someone like Netflix or Amazon that can give you thousands of pieces of content for, whatever it is, $5.99 a month. And I'm asking you to support my Patreon for the same amount to get one piece of content every 2 months. There's always going to be a difficulty. You're always going to be up against a friction. Sorry, I know that was a bit of a ramble, but the takeaways for me are that history is an imperfect guide, but the only guide we have, the only way to illuminate the future and the present, is through what we know about what we've inherited from the past. There are some loose trends in history, but humans are not automatons. They can react and reflect and we're often quite a reactive species. We're a rebellious species. So even if a trend turns out to be difficult to resist, we'll do the best we can to resist it. The second takeaway is that we've lived in the very early stages of the internet, and the first movers are probably going to have been quite privileged there, and things are always going to change, and that it's always going to be difficult, especially if you're making more difficult content. And, with some people, I think there's an assumption that if your content isn't being seen, it's because the algorithm's punishing you because of a sense of unfairness or whatever. If you're making anything that's more than entertainment, even a modicum more, that is always and always has been difficult to get people to watch, to read, to be seen. It's only a minority of people that do any very serious reading in the world, and that is just a fact about people's lives, about how difficult it is, about how much time they have, how much they're working, and what they're interested in. Most people are interested in entertainment, friends, family, food, all the good things in life. So the next consequence of that is, if we've lived in a period of a kind of golden age for early movers, and that we can't expect people to or YouTube to just serve our videos, and that more and more people are going to be doing it, and that the big channels, media spaces will continue to get more powerful, then it's only going to get more and more difficult to sustain your work. Some of the greatest thinkers of all time, someone like Schopenhauer, who I'm reading a lot about at the moment, was completely underappreciated for the vast majority of his life, and he was a genius. And that's someone like Schopenhauer. So, the average YouTuber or someone just talking nonsense like I am right now, I should not expect this video to be viewed 1 million times. So increasingly, I think creators are going to have to know their space, know who they're talking to, add as much genuine, authentic value to people's lives as possible, so that people will want to support them, whether that's on Patreon or elsewhere. And I think, when I say paywall before, it's a dirty word, but again, that is how 95% of people's brains are wired, that if you can watch something for free without supporting, you are going to. So you have to add an incentive for people to come and support you. And Patreon's doing a bit better job of that with, allowing ad-free videos and more functionality. And I'm trying to do a better job of that by making that more of a community of people that are interested in some of the more foundational questions about history and philosophy. I've got the Thinking Differently About History 2-hour course. And I'm doing the same for philosophy at the moment. I'm writing that, so that'll be up soon. We're going to have to just continue to try harder and innovate. Anyway, if you got to this point, thank you so much for listening to me ramble on. I'm sorry. This has just been a bit of a quick experiment in rambling and walking around just for my own sake. So if you're watching it, thanks. I'll see you soon.